Okay.
Hi, my name is John Kozinski. I'm a macrobiotic teacher and a counselor. I travel around the U.S. and I also am one of the senior teachers at the Kushi Institute. I've been counseling for the last 30 years. Learned about macrobiotics about 35 years ago. I had no personal health problems. I just was interested in personal development and read a book by George Osawa. And a couple of months later I met Michio Kushi and then started a long association studying with him, and then began studying about the macrobiotic way in many, many different ways, and then started counseling people about 30 years ago. Began consultations and teaching. And I've been teaching at the Kushi Institute a long time, but I also travel around the U.S. to Chicago and New York City, Connecticut, and sometimes new places.
So how has Macrobiotics changed since you've started?
Macrobiotics what I understand about it has changed since I began doing this. In the beginning, it was more focused on the philosophy and somewhat on health, and that was my focus. And then it's been more geared towards health. And now I think it's continued to evolve as I know that my teaching of it has evolved as you see what works for people and what doesn't. I think it was in the beginning a bit idealistic about what people need. And now we're getting more practical in understanding people's dietary and health needs and basically how to do it in modern society. So I think the major change is just the evolution of the understanding of how a macrobiotic approach is more like a traditional way of eating and living, but we have to make that fit for modern times and modern conditions, which make it very different than what's sometimes presented.
So what are the challenges for macrobiotics, living in the...
Well, the challenges, of course, is very basic things like cooking. It's also how to understand how to apply... one of the things that happened over the years, I think, is that people saw there's a macrobiotic diet and there's a macrobiotic lifestyle, when the original idea was there's a macrobiotic approach to diet and a macrobiotic approach to lifestyle. And I think people have forgotten that and have tried to use a formula. And the formula didn't always work for people, especially people living in modern times, so that we have to be able to teach practical ways to cook more naturally and to understand balance.
So how important is intuition? Because sometimes I think before people lose their intuition to kind of a set of rules.
Well, I think that intuition and logic are the yin-yang poles. So you have to use your intuition, and then if your intuition is not correct, you have to use your logic. But I think what is needed is a better understanding of the principles of balance and how it applies to things like nutrition and food and energetics of life and lifestyle as well, so that people can use a good logical approach too, as well as an intuitive approach. I think intuition and logic are the two poles that we always use. And trusting your feeling alone sometimes doesn't work. Trusting your intellect alone doesn't work also. We have to use both. But I think there's a better way. As we teach the principles of balance better, I think people will be able to understand it better. The principles of balance, I think, has to be applied better to even understanding modern nutrition, which is not often understood either. It appears that some people practice a macrobiotic way of eating very simply, and some people then, of course, sometimes people practice it wider, but more than not, people actually practice too narrow, and they end up becoming deficient in certain nutrients after the initial period. So we have to be able to understand modern nutrition from the principles of balance also, which I think is a new area.
So you work with Chinese medicine and herbs. How important is that in terms of macrobiotics?
Chinese medicine is macrobiotics, in my view. Macrobiotics is not Japanese, but macrobiotics was practiced in Japan, it was practiced in China, it was practiced in Asia, in India. The macrobiotic approach, the traditional Chinese medicine, I think, is a macrobiotic approach because it's to me, a macrobiotic approach is an approach to life using the principles of balance, so that there's a use of things that came from China, but of course then we always have to update it for modern times. So the use of herbs can be very helpful if a person knows how to use them in a real practical way, applying the principles of balance. I use that a little bit, and then I refer to other people who, if they need to use that even more. And I think there's a role for that, because there was a role traditionally. In Japan, the original macrobiotics before George Osawa, and there was a macrobiotics there before George Osawa, used herbs, used teas, used local plants. So I think this is something that we haven't applied as much, but some people are applying it, and I think we can use that. But what I call that is traditional macrobiotics, Asian macrobiotics. Chinese medicine was originally a macrobiotic medicine.
So how important is like spiritual practice or connecting with your heart and with the logic as well?
Well, again, depends on how you define the spiritual practice. People often define spirituality as something really removed from this world, or that you do in a monastery. Or I think that one of the things I learned from Michio Kushi years ago is that everything is spirit. Everything has a certain essence or energy or vitality. But I think what most people think of as spirit or spirituality is connecting to something that is we're part of, that's greater. And I think that's an important, for people, it's important to do some kind of practice that connects them to that experience of something bigger than themselves, and then it changes your day-to-day life. As far as following your heart, I think also then just depends on what you mean by that too. It's something like following your heart is, to me, something similar to following your intuition. You follow that, the deepest sense of what you think you need to do and where you need to go. This is, people usually, I find, especially if we talk about this a little bit in macrobiotic classes, they discover that. When you eat better and live healthfully, you start to get in touch with something inside of yourself that is directing you. And sometimes practices help for that, like meditation practices and other practices can help that. Sometimes organized practices from religion also can help, but it depends on the person.
So what is not being macrobiotic compared to being macrobiotic?
I think not being macrobiotic is not applying the principles of balance.
But,
people intuitively can do that, but I think that, for instance, if someone's eating white sugar and refined foods, that would be not macrobiotic if that was their daily diet, because macrobiotics is based on the principles of balance. Principles of balance means the center of our diet will be grains and vegetables.
Aren't they naturally trying to create balance, but unconsciously? Right.
Well, but I think the intuitive balance, if you go back to the cultures like in the longevity cultures that were studied in Ecuador and Okinawa and the Russian Caucasus, they had an intuitive sense of balance there. And then cultures like China and Japan and other parts of Asia and India, they taught about it. They taught about longevity. To me, that's another definition of macrobiotics, the way of longevity. So being not macrobiotic means not applying the principles of balance. That doesn't mean that we never touch anything else that isn't natural. It just means that if you're applying the principles of balance, your eating would mostly be with natural foods with a certain sense of balance. And of course, we're all working at it, because that's why we say we're practicing macrobiotics. We're not getting it perfect. We're practicing.
So what would your piece of advice be for new people starting?
For new people, I would suggest that they really try to follow some guidelines, either from books or from counselors or teachers, to experience this, because then you can experience the benefits of it. For some people, some of the guidelines in the books are a little narrow, and they need a little more richer foods, including some animal foods like fish and oils, and a little bit different approach. But the basic diet of eating grains and vegetables and beans and small amounts of other foods like fish, fruits, nuts, seeds, is something that if you experience it and you give yourself some time, like 6 to 9 months, then you'll know the truth of that. It's helpful to understand why it works, but that's to me is not more important than the experience of it.